Boy, what a beautiful, beautiful capital. Should be very proud as Iowans. I was very honored to meet Governor Branstad. I'm not sure how honored he was to meet me. He came over and said, all right, who let you in? Also had weather whiplash today. Woke up and it was snow and sleet and ice. Now, I'm from California. I'm not even sure what that is. And now look at it. I'll accept your thanks anytime I brought it. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here. It is quite an honor to be in front of you all and to speak on an issue that I think it's too short a shrift in our public discourse, and that is the assisted suicide issue. Assisted suicide, when you think about it, is one of the most radical agenda items to come down the public policy pike, if you will, in the last several hundred years. Think about this. 100 years ago, if you had appendicitis, you died in agony. 100 years ago, if you contracted bone cancer, you died in agony. 100 years ago, in fact, the Civil War veterans who were honored in your rotunda, if they got a gut wound during the Civil War, they died in agony. And yet at those times, there was no discussion about death with dignity. There was no discussion about legalizing euthanasia. There was no discussion that somehow being poisoned to death with a drug overdose was more dignified and respectable than dying a natural death. And we have to think about why that is. When you talk to elderly people and people say, well, I support assisted suicide because I don't want to be a burden. How did we make it so that our fathers and mothers, our aunts and our uncles think they can possibly be a burden upon us? We need to look very hard in the mirror and look to find out what it is that we are doing to make people feel unwelcome if they are ill, if they are disabled, if they are elderly, or if they are dying. Because when you say, okay, we'll allow assisted suicide for some people, you are sending a very loud and clear message that their lives don't matter as much as the lives of other people who you would give suicide prevention to. It is a lack of equality. And when you think about the idea that killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering, which is the fundamental premise of euthanasia and assisted suicide, well, how in the world do you put brakes on that agenda once you've got it into motion? Because if killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering, how do you limit the concept of human suffering to the terminally ill, which we often hear in this country? But realize that terminal illness is not what this agenda is about. That is a political tactic in America because Americans still are very wary of this entire assisted suicide movement. In fact, I was really happy to see that in November 2012, Massachusetts had an opportunity to legalize assisted suicide and said no. It didn't get that much attention in the media as if it had said yes, but Massachusetts, not exactly the Bible Belt, said no to assisted suicide. And there's a reason for that. And I'd like to go over some of the issues that have occurred in countries where euthanasia and assisted suicide have not only been legalized, but been embraced by the population. Let's go first to the Netherlands. Euthanasia has been permitted in the Netherlands since 1972 thanks to a court ruling. How often do we hear that, right? In which it went for many years as a decriminalized approach as long as you followed the supposed guidelines, and then was formally legalized about 12 years ago. During that time, Dutch doctors went from killing the terminally ill who asked for it, and by the way, killing means to be made dead or to cause to die. It's not a pejorative, it's descriptive. From killing the terminally ill who asked for it, to killing the chronically ill who asked for it, to killing people with disabilities who asked for it, now to killing elderly people who are tired of life who ask for it, and it's even moved into infanticide, where babies born with serious illnesses or serious disabilities are euthanized in their cribs. According to the Lancet, which has done 2 studies of Dutch pediatric practice in this regard, 8% of all infants today in the Netherlands who die are killed by doctors. That's not 8% of all infants. 8% of all infants who die in the Netherlands are killed, lethally injected by doctors. And yet, we are told this is a limited agenda. We are told this is only for the terminally ill for whom nothing else can be done to alleviate suffering. False premise. Because if you talk to hospice professionals today, you know tremendous amounts can be done to alleviate suffering. And the people who are asking for euthanasia, the people who are asking for assisted suicide, not only in the Netherlands but in the United States, it isn't because they can't get good pain control. It's because they're worried about being a burden. It's because they're worried about losing the ability to engage in enjoyable activities. It's because they're worried about appearing to have no dignity. And again, how did we let anybody in this country think that because they have a serious illness, they have lost their human dignity? Things get worse in the Netherlands. They have moved euthanasia practice into the psychiatric wards. Psychiatrists are now euthanizing patients who are mentally ill. In fact, the Dutch Minister of Health just announced the other day that last year 45 mentally ill patients were euthanized by psychiatrists. Think about that. The last bastion, often for a suicidal, mentally ill person, keeping them, putting one foot in front of the other, keeping them from falling into that deep darkness from which no light escapes, is a dedicated psychiatrist who may believe in the life of that patient when the patient has lost the ability to believe in it, him or herself. And yet in the Netherlands now, you have an increasing number of psychiatrists who say the cure for mental illness is a lethal injection. That comes from accepting the premise that killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering. It's even worse in Belgium. Belgium legalized euthanasia in 2002. If you pay any attention to the headlines coming out of that country, you now see how very widespread this idea of alleviating suffering becomes, because the concept of suffering itself becomes very elastic. There were a pair of twins, identical twins in Belgium last year, I believe. They were both deaf. They were dedicated, as identical twins tend to be, to each other, and they started to lose their eyesight. Worried about not being able to see each other again, they asked for euthanasia, and they were granted it. They were killed together. And the doctor came out and said how peaceful the deaths were. What a waste of life. Recently, there was a woman who was transsexual, had a sex change operation, and was very unhappy with the sex change operation, asked for euthanasia, and was granted it. What a waste of life. In Belgium, they are now doing joint euthanasia deaths of elderly couples who don't want to live apart. And they are now legalizing euthanasia for children. They just did that. And there's no age limit for the children who can be euthanized. And one of the guidelines for child euthanasia will be the child has to write a note saying, "I want to die." Can you imagine asking an 8-year-old to write a note, "Tell me you want to die, you want me to kill you"? That's now the law in Belgium, just passed by the parliament. This is the kind of thing that happens when you lose the idea that all life has equal intrinsic value simply and merely because it's human. This is the kind of thing that happens when you think that ending suffering should extend to eliminating the sufferer. Now I hear people saying, yes, Wesley, this is happening in Belgium, this is happening in the Netherlands, and by the way, this is not slippery slope argumentation. People say, oh, you're being an alarmist, you're arguing the slippery slope. No, I'm arguing facts on the ground. These are undeniable fundamental, citable facts that have occurred in Belgium and occurred in the Netherlands. In Switzerland, they have suicide clinics where people fly in to be made dead. And they've had the same kind of suicides there. That's pro-suicide culture. You've had joint suicides. You've had suicides of disabled people. And you've had suicides of the Supreme Court of Switzerland declare a right to suicide for the mentally ill, as occurs in the Netherlands. People will say, but Wesley, that's not happening in Oregon where we have assisted suicide, or Washington. And indeed, they're not killing people in Washington or Oregon who are mentally ill. Why might that be? First, in this country, we haven't gone as far down that moral cliff as they have in the 3 countries I mentioned. But that doesn't mean there haven't been any abuses. I want you to all go home, or turn on your computers when I'm done speaking, turn on your phones, and Google the name Barbara Wagner. In 2008, Barbara Wagner had terminal lung cancer. Her doctor prescribed life-extending chemotherapy. We're not talking about a curative chemotherapy, but to extend the life 9 months, extend the life 1 year. That is a legitimate and normal part of ordinary cancer care. She was dying. She wanted to live as long as she could. Her doctor prescribed chemotherapy. But Oregon has rationed health care in Medicaid. And considering all of the discussions we have these days about cost containment in medicine, this should give us all chills up our spine. Medicaid in Oregon refused to pay for the treatment of Barbara Wagner to have her life extended 9 months or a year, and sent her a letter saying, but we will pay for your assisted suicide. I want you to think about that for a second. The state of Oregon officially said that the life of Barbara Wagner was not worth paying to extend, but they would pay to end it. Vermont has just passed a single-payer health plan that they can't fund. Editorials have already appeared saying the way we help fund our new single-payer health plan is healthcare rationing and assisted suicide. And if you come to believe that any of us is expendable, that any of us is discardable, and if you start thinking, well, we've got to save all of this money for healthcare, think about the financial, economic forces of gravity that are going to be unleashed in this country. It may take $100,000 worth of loving, compassionate, involved care for a patient to make them so they do not wish to commit suicide. Yet a suicide may cost $1,000. Think about where that could lead. I remember going to the Netherlands and discussing this issue with pro-euthanasia doctors who believed in euthanasia very much for their country. And they said, but you better not do it in the United States, because in the United States it will become about money. And that's why I'm really glad to be asked to speak here today before the crisis arises, before the legislation is being pushed, so that you can begin to think about what kind of a society do we want Iowa to be? What kind of compassion do we want Iowans to express to each other? What kind of medicine do we want Iowa doctors to practice? Is it going to be one of inclusion, one of equality, one of care, or is it going to be one of abandonment, one of killing, and one of cost containment based on some of us not staying in this world? Thank you very much for your time, your attention, and for your hospitality.